If you could invest in one company that's not the company you work for, who would it be?
I think Common Room. I feel like I still believe dev tools are having a moment. I think dev communities are really interesting, and tracking not in an enterprise way, but tracking individual developer adopters of dev tools is very powerful. And I am optimistic about the future of dev tools, startups in general. So yeah, Common Room.
What tool or technology could you not live without?
I like to think that I can live without anything, but I can't live without most things. I would say it's probably my super high resolution monitor. So I think that I am 5 times more productive with my monitor. Whenever I work without it, I get eye strain, I get less done. It's very great. Yeah.
Which person influenced you the most in your career?
Hey everyone, it's Sean Faulkner, and today on the show we have founder and CEO of Akita Software and now head of product at Postman, Dr. Professor Gene Yang. Gene has a super interesting background, a former computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon University with a focus on programming language research. She then went on to found Akita Software, which was focused on solving hard problems around the API observability space. And last year she was acquired, or the company was acquired by Postman. And during the interview, we covered a lot of ground talking about Gene's academic experience, motivations for starting a company, and the problem Akita set out to work on. It was hard to keep, everything focused on a single topic with Gene because she's done so many interesting things and has lots to say. She's a great guest, super chatty, strong opinions, hot takes. I really enjoyed this one. One last thing before I kick it over to the interview. My apologies for my voice. I was struggling through a cold during the interview, but hey, there is no sick days in podcasting. So I soldiered on. I'm a professional, but I might not sound the way I normally do. Maybe I sound better. I don't know. All right, let's take things over to my interview with Gene.
Gene, welcome to Software Huddle.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. So it turns out, as I was preparing for this conversation, it turns out you and I actually have quite a bit in common in terms of the start of our careers. We both did PhDs in computer science, postdocs in medical schools, eventually became entrepreneurs and sold those companies. Can you walk me through your past and your journey in academics to founding and growing Akita to where you're now sort of fresh off this acquisition and your position at Postman?
Yeah, no, I also looked you up and it does seem like we have a lot in common. For me, I've always been driven by this idea that I should be working on a problem that's important to humanity. I grew up in a software family. That's sort of what I've always known. I feel like that's where my natural skills and experience lies. And a lot of my career has been about reconciling how do I work on software while working on something that's good for people. And so I feel like you can sum up my career in terms of most of the time I was happy with my decision that developer tools are really important. Software is what I believe to be the biggest social problem no one's talking about. Everything's coming to run on software. Software bugs are becoming, huge vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, for at the country level, at the everything level. And I feel like every now and then I have this interlude where I'm like, man, am I really saving lives? And then I try to apply software to medical things, and then I come back and I'm like, no, dev tools, that's where it's at. So I did my undergrad in computer science. I got my PhD at MIT in programming languages, so with a focus on programming model to automatically enforce security policies. I did a brief 1 year. It was a pre-batical of sorts, so I had gotten a tenure track job at Carnegie Mellon in the programming languages group. And something that's in fashion is to take a postdoc once you have the job just to hang out for a bit. And so that was do I want to be working, on software for protein modeling to cure cancer, or am I still really committed to dev tools? And what I realized was, no, I'm really committed to dev tools. I'm a dev tools person still. I was at Carnegie Mellon for a couple of years, and then I was getting really into this idea that I felt like APIs were a big part of both the problem and the cure for a lot of what I was seeing. So I can get more into that later, but APIs weren't really a hot topic in programming languages research, but in industry, they were all over the place. And so I concluded the best way to work on tooling around APIs was to leave. And I ended up starting Akita. And now I am head of product and observability at Postman, working on very similar things to what I did at Akita.
Awesome. And then, one of the struggles I had when I was in doing my postdoc, and I had similar motivations where I wanted to be able to use sort of my technical skills to work on something that was going to like benefit, humankind. And which attracted me to working sort of in bioinformatics. And it felt like I was, doing something meaningful there. But I think one of the struggles I had was things just felt like they moved so slow that I wasn't actually having as much impact as I could if I actually went and kind of started something myself. Was that something that you kind of ran into as well?
Yes and no. I do love the pace of things in startups. I think it's amazing that, you operate on the time scale of days and weeks rather than months and years. And in fact, I had an academic friend who said, whoa, I'm really glad I'm in academia, because just watching how things are unfolding for you over the course of days, that's really, that's too much for me. So the speed definitely is something interesting. I feel like being in programming and being in systems, in academia, it's a little bit faster because you can have open source systems. And I think the pace of publishing is slow, but I think a lot of people didn't let that hold up the pace of dissemination or anything like that. But there was one big bottleneck to me, which was the pace of tech transfer was extremely slow, because what you had was you could write a paper or you could do something, and then you either waited for this to make its way into a mainstream programming language or a mainstream tool that people design, which could be upwards of 15 years. And so, a lot of the new types that we saw in the Swift programming language in the last 5 years, they've been around since the 70s. Or you could wait until someone at Amazon or Google picked up what you were doing. And this is a very specific narrow subset of all research papers. And so then you're tied to both tech transfer curves and also, big FANG timelines. And so for me, the starting a company and now joining Postman seemed to be much faster ways of taking my ideas and directly giving a way for developers to start picking them up.
Vision. You mentioned when you were discussing your background, how you saw software as one of the largest social problems that exist. Can you, elaborate a little bit on that? What specifically do you mean in terms of software being the social problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I read a fantastic quote a few years ago about data, how data is like a corrosive acid, where it's just sitting there. It can only it can really go, it can only implode or explode, but it's like a ticking time bomb. And not to be super negative, because I think software is great. It's what allows for so many things, but at the same time, the legacy systems and the legacy subsystems that are running a lot of our lives, they are also, huge vulnerabilities. And so I saw this interesting story that I didn't post for reasons that it might be very political, and I'll say it now. You can cut this if it's not appropriate. But I saw this story yesterday about how this Ukrainian hacker hacked the lights of a Russian apartment building to show the Ukrainian flag. And now the apartment building owner is in big trouble. And so like these kinds of things were always top of mind. Like you're only able to do something like that if software is running it. Well, you're only able to control lights very well these days if software is running it. You can only hack into it if there's a vulnerability in the software. But if we think about our entire lives, from our homes to our banking systems to our cars to what's running all the commerce that's producing what we are consuming, our supply chain, our social networks, these are all software. And it's I mean, not to take too military of an angle on it. These are like, national security risks. They're also just like, our lives are just very dependent on software. And people talk about, many other things like climate, or they talk about food shortages or all these things. But my take is, hey, look, there are a lot of risks and there's a lot of potential for control of our lives that software has created that most of us aren't thinking about, most of us aren't talking about. Although I will say a lot of people have started talking about this in the context of AI. I have I have the view that AI is not that different from other software. We've been letting software control our lives for a very long time. And if we weren't scared of software then, we shouldn't be as scared of software now, but the baseline level of fear should have maybe always been higher.
Yeah. I mean, I think in particular, and I've talked about this in previous shows as well, is like, I think when technology feels somehow closer to something that like humans can do, whether it's AI or a robotic system or something like that, and it's complicated and it's hard to explain and people don't fully understand it, people have a more of a like sort of like fearful reaction to it for some reason. And also I think like, media feeds into that to a certain degree, but I think you make some excellent points in terms of the scale of all these different software systems. Is very different than, 40 years ago when we lived in a disconnected world. We might use software in our day-to-day lives if we worked in an office or something like that. But the sort of impact of a problem, which is much more constrained, is kind of the difference between, if I go to a bar in San Francisco and they ID me and I show my driver's license number, like in theory, if that person has a photographic memory or something like that, they're going to get some, level of information about me, my address, my, a little bit of my biometrics and stuff like that in my date of birth. But that's very different than me taking a picture of my driver's license and posting it on Twitter, which I would strongly advise against. But the scale essentially of these types of problems is much, much bigger now because we have all these connected systems as well.
Yeah. And similarly, before your lights just worked as lights, but now if they're controlled by IoT, that's something, anyone with access to that system can now do something about. Before, if you're just getting food from the grocery store and making it or going to a restaurant, now, there's subtle things that software can influence you by, if you're ordering all your stuff via apps. And so there's like sinister things. And then there's just small ways software just changes how we live our lives. And I feel like in the research community, I worked on a lot of this from the point of view of correctness and reliability. I had colleagues who worked on this from the point of view of something closer to media studies, or, how things like how social media influences people's behaviors or elections or things like that. But there's just a lot that software is doing these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that you have some strong takes as well on sort of, I guess, like the industry obsession or focus on sort of programmers or software trying to like emulate what's coming out of like the big FANG companies, essentially. Like, if Google does it, then, and I'm starting a company today, then I need to architect the system the way that like Google architects the system. So do you think that we tend to over-engineer products by sort of over-indexing on what we're seeing coming out of these like marquee brand companies, which might actually not be sort of a fit for whatever that we're doing or building?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not necessarily people's fault, but if you look at what, there's two things. One is, if you look at what, computer science students are learning in school, it's closer to, what the big companies are doing. So at least when I was a professor, we were teaching things like, this is how you scale a system a lot, or, here's how you do like crazy algorithms to get stuff like, down to this. And I think that, a lot of people, when they come out of school and they've learned all this stuff, it can be very jarring to realize, hey, exponential algorithms are not terrible most of the time. And in very few situations in your life will, tweaks on big O complexity like make a huge, huge difference. Unless you're processing things at Google or Amazon scale. So I think it's not even necessarily like a Google or Amazon scale problem, but when you learn algorithms or when you learn data structures, what actually feels like you're making use of these lessons is this hyperscale stuff. And then I think another part of it is if you look at the well-written blog posts out there, they often come out of the big companies who can afford to spend time having an engineer, spend the month cleaning up that blog post. They have the marketing department to disseminate that, or there's enough people with enough bandwidth to really provide polished content for the world about this is how we did this is how we did that. And so I think it's not necessarily people's fault that they say, well, so-and-so at Google did it this way. It both resonates with their sensibilities about this is what a cohesive case study looks like. And it also might resonate with what they learned in school or boot camp. And so, of course, people are going to gravitate towards that. And I think that there's also a sense of if you're not doing things at that scale, is it a blog post to scoff at or is it not? And I think there hasn't been an analogous genre of, I wrote this like very simple exponential time algorithm. It took me 5 minutes, but look, it got me, 10 million users. And I would love to see more of those posts, or maybe not even 10 million users, but look, I'm a software developer at a mom and pop shop. Like, actually, this is all we need. I think that like that genre of blog post isn't necessarily valued the same way. And it really isn't a thing yet.
Yeah. I mean, you're really seeing like the Instagram version of what's going on within these companies anyway, because as you mentioned, like they're creating a very sort of polished asset that they're going to put out there that helps with their recruiting and promoting whatever they're doing, but it's not necessarily telling the full story of even what's going on within the company. Do you think also that there might be a challenge in terms of, people copying things that they see without like fully understanding what they're copying and just assuming that that's the way that they should be doing things?
Yeah, so there are also great blog posts. I think there's multiple blog posts out there. If you search "you are not Google," people have written blog posts about that. And I think that again, it's partly blog posts aren't like, oh, well, this is how much data Google processes in a day, and so here are all of our stats for how we decided to do it this way. And then part of it is people are just saying, hey, this is what we have to do. I think the more senior engineers I've worked with have been experienced enough to qualify, well, this is what we have to support. It doesn't make sense for us to do it that way. But I think that, it is very tempting for a lot of engineers to reach for patterns that are well known.
Yeah, I also think that there's a certain, especially if you're coming out of sort of a classically trained computer science program, there's, you might sort of fall in love with certain like approaches or something like that, where like we mentioned, I want to get the optimal big O from this, thing, whether it makes sense for what you're trying to do is like, oh, I actually only have 5 users. I can probably just, hack this thing together. It doesn't matter whether it runs in log n or n squared or exponential at that point.
Yeah. And I mean, we never taught that in school. If I look at the entire curriculum that I was familiar with, there's never a problem that said, hey, you have 5 users. You have to ship this in 2 days. What algorithmic shortcuts do you take to do this? That just wasn't part of any class that I took or taught.
Yeah. Yeah, when I talked to Joe Reese, who's well known in the data engineering space, like one of the things that we talked about was how now people kind of fall in love with this idea, this like complicated modern data stack where we're plugging together like hundreds of different tools when a lot of times something really simple like a Python script and an Excel spreadsheet might actually solve the problem. So it's kind of getting back to this like practical computer science versus and looking at it in terms of what do I need to accomplish now versus, what do I need to do if I'm serving billions of people or something like that.
Yeah. And I think it also goes back to people love to see complex setups. They love to see kind of like the sci-fi version. And so it's really hard to say, here's my setup. I have two tools. It takes a certain level of reputation and confidence for the person who's posting that not to just expect to be laughed off of the internet. And it also takes an amount of reputation and confidence for people not to laugh that person off the internet.
Yeah. It's hard to write like a blog post about architecture, which is like a super simple thing where you just have, I don't know, like a front end application running in an EC2 instance with a database on the same server or something like that. People are going to be like, oh, what is this? Like, where are your, 50 different AWS services and so forth?
Absolutely. I think that, a lot of like small apps I see, like you're maybe using SQLite. You start out using SQLite, then you move to Postgres. And I think there's a lot of temptation to say like, okay, let's do something really fancy now. But, I think people feel ashamed, or they just don't feel like there's an audience for people showing their super simple setups. Or, I just think that there's, from building a tool that's targeted towards earlier companies, from building a tool that's targeted towards companies that don't have the bandwidth or the resources to really set everything up, there's some patterns I've seen that every time I talked about them, people come out of the woodwork and they all say, that's my setup too. But just nobody else talks about it, which is, too bad, because I think people could really help each other out by trading notes about their SQLite setups.
Yeah. All right. Well, for those listening, you heard it here. Share your stuff regardless of whether you think it's too simple or not.
Yeah, yeah. I think people are just like, well, I'm not at scale yet. And it's like, come on, most of us are never going to be at that scale. It's fine. It's really helpful to people to share where you are now.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about Akita and your time and motivation to become an entrepreneur. So maybe we start with motivation. Like you talked about the, wanting to work on things that are, do good in the world and have impact. But why? There's lots of ways of doing that. Like, why become an entrepreneur? Like, why take on that headache? There's a lot of problems beyond just like having impact that come along with being the founder of a company.
Yeah, starting company was not my first choice of how to go about this problem. But I had always been prepared to start a company if I needed to. So, before starting Akita, I had done the requisite, entrepreneur curious things. Like I took the entrepreneurship class when I was in grad school. I'd spent a year thinking about starting a different company with a friend when I was in grad school. She was in business school, and I learned a lot from doing that. I met a lot of other entrepreneurs. That ultimately didn't go anywhere, but I got a sense of this is what it would take to start a company. And then I also started an accelerator in collaboration with Highland Capital in 2015 with a friend. That friend went on to become a proper VC for a few years, but it was mostly a project where he had this idea for the accelerator, and I felt that he needed someone to help him do it. And I was curious to learn a little more about it too. It's called Cybersecurity Factory. There's like a couple dozen companies that have gone through it, including like us, early stages of Akita. And so prior to starting Akita, I had a decent idea of what it would take to start a company. I didn't really want to do entrepreneurship for the sake of entrepreneurship. That's what I learned from my 1 year. I thought about starting a company in grad school. I realized that I'm pretty tied to the technical skills that I have, the technical perspective I have, the technical insights I have. When you spend over a decade developing that, it's first of all, it's a shame to throw that away, but also that's just what you live and breathe. Like it's exciting to be. It's exciting to have insights about something, and I realized that that's just the things I have insights about. Although that said, the kinds of technical insights I had around developer tools and programming languages, those usually get put to use on platform teams or internal tools teams or programming language research teams within much bigger companies. And so at the time, I was, thinking about, I am interested in working on API related problems outside of academia, the first thing I did was go to my friends at Google, go to my friends at Facebook, see what they were working on and see what kind of match there was. And what I realized was Google and Facebook are working on Google Facebook scale problems. And so most of the super technical problems that Google and Facebook work on, and even Amazon, I had my friends at Amazon as well, they were like super large scale scaling problems. I've never been a scaling person. I've always been more of a like, here's an innovative programming model, or did you think about the world this way kind of person. And I felt like, like putting me on a scaling problem wasn't the right fit at the time. What I really wanted to do was think about, there's so many APIs, how can we better understand systems with heterogeneous APIs? How can we better incorporate legacy systems into what we're doing? And doing this as a startup would be harder because, it's kind of like a multi-year effort, like multi-decade effort in some ways, but it would give me the time to really test out these ideas with smaller customers than all of Amazon or all of Facebook, or even one team within Amazon, which is needing to serve requests at the scale of Amazon, if that makes sense. And so once I realized that, I looked down the path of starting a company, and most startups fail. Most dev tool startups definitely fail. But I was okay with the fact that even if we were independent for a few years, I could work out some of these ideas enough to carve out a niche so that we could continue the vision as part of a bigger company. And that's effectively what's happening now at Postman.
So when you were starting, you mentioned you focus on like trying to figure out a way to understand what's happening with all these different APIs and heterogeneous APIs. So what was the specific problem that you wanted to try to address and solve for?
Yeah. So here's what I noticed when I talked to every single software team. So when I was a professor, I spent a lot of time just visiting industry teams, talking with people I met when I spoke at industry conferences. And what struck me was over and over again, they'd say, Gene, the ideas you talk about sound fantastic. If we lived in an ideal world, that would be great. But here's what we're dealing with. And even my advisor once joked that some of the techniques that we were that I was talking about were like, if you went to the doctor and the doctor said, well, you kind of have some problems, but if you just ate healthy since the day you were born, you wouldn't be having those problems right now. It doesn't help at that point. So there are a few specific topics that I was interested in. One was that I was working on programming language design and program analysis, like static analysis, dynamic analysis. And all of that was about, how do we have airtight guarantees on languages at the application layer. And what I realized was software was so much bigger than a single application layer. It was, the application layer and then everything below. And it was the application layer and everything you're calling across the network. And so this is where API calls really came into my consciousness. And in fact, one of the last papers I wrote in academia was about how to enforce security policies across REST APIs, because there are like a few things motivating that paper that I can get into at some point. But what I realized from this paper was that REST APIs were very simple. REST APIs were kind of a boundary that you could start enforcing things. And it was often much simpler to look at what's happening at the REST API layer. Or, it doesn't have to be REST. It could be gRPC, it could be GraphQL, it could be something else. But it's often much simpler and impactful to look at what's happening at the API layer instead of every single line of code. Because what I was running into was, I had drank the Kool-Aid of if you use types everywhere, it's great. And, anytime you interface with an untyped language, what happens? Or if you use this nice, safe language, it's great. But anytime you make an API call, what happens? And so I felt like if what I was interested in was software reliability and getting a handle on this is what's going on with our software systems, this is how we have cross-system guarantees, moving up a level and operating at the REST API layer was going to be more impactful. So that was the first part of it. And the second part of it was I had been living in the world of airtight guarantees. Like, I want to be able to prove this bound on the number of times I access this memory resource, or I want to prove that, the memory never gets touched in this way. And I sort of inverted how I felt about software systems. So previously it was about, I know exactly what guarantee I want to enforce. And every tool that I'm working on, every action that I'm working toward is in the name of enforcing guarantees. What I realized was people actually don't know a lot of the emergent behaviors that their system is about to do. And a lot of making sure your software is making sense is about eyeballing if the emergent behaviors are okay. If those emergent behaviors are manifesting themselves in the form of log lines, that's a little hard. And so one of my goals was to give people a way to understand what their software was doing at a higher level than logs, and based on things they didn't necessarily think to log. And again, watching software at the API layer was very appealing to me there. So going back to your question of what problem was I trying to solve, there was this idea that we don't have a handle on what our software systems are doing. We're not able to guarantee or have some sense of confidence that the software is doing what it's supposed to. But there's a bigger problem, which is what is the software supposed to do has become more unclear.
So you talked about these like emergent behaviors. So can you give an example of what you mean by an emergent behavior in a software system?
Yeah, a very simple one is permission systems. So you might think that a lot of permission systems are very cut and dry. Like Alice can see this, Bob cannot. And this is because Alice is my friend and Bob is not. And if you talk to people responsible for enforcing these permission systems, like in practice, it's actually there are much more complex interactions. So if we think about just like Facebook or Instagram, right? There's friend relationships and there's friends of friends and there's pages. There's all kinds of different components. So what I actually am and am not allowed to see depends on how the components are interacting, how permissions got implemented across these components. So if I just wanted to prove, like my friends can always see this and other people can't, that might not actually be provable because there's like 1,000 exceptions, if that makes sense. And so this is actually the example that made me realize, hey, like any property that you might care about a software system, it's not so cut and dried. It's actually super implementation based. And you kind of have to like have some way of looking at what's actually going on. And so Mark on my team said he once saw a talk by someone who said that, a very major retail company software team, how they understood their permissions on their site was they just went and documented, like, this is all the cases that people can see different things. So that's one example. Another example is, I think a lot of teams, if you ask them up front, like, how many errors do you tolerate on this endpoint? Or, how many like timeouts do you tolerate? It's not zero. But the actual number, like there's no like platonic number of errors you tolerate. It's just really like, what was it like last week? Was everything roughly okay? Were people able to refresh and things kind of worked out, And so I think this model of software rules can all be derived philosophically. It is becoming increasingly less of a fit with reality.
So how are companies, outside of using something like what you're providing at Akita or we're providing there, how are they like traditionally like trying to solve these different problems? Is it just sort of combing through log files if they're doing anything at all?
So what we're trying to do is so today, if you want to, make sure your system is generally reliable and robust and you're a more mature company, you would get something like Datadog, you'd get something like New Relic, you would spend a bunch of time setting it up, getting graphs, and doing what I was describing, eyeballing things week over week. When there's an incident, making sure you look at the right graphs. There was a period of time I was asking people to walk me through their Grafana setups, and one guy showed me his 200 Grafana dashboards. I'm sure it takes non-trivial time to set up 200 Grafana dashboards. But I think you can take the time and put together, enough tools to eyeball it. What we're building at Akita, the goal is, or I guess what we were building with Akita, what we're building with Postman Live Insights now is, we want to give people software or the understanding of your production system, like in a box. 4 dummies in a box. Within 15 minutes, you get to see something about your system. And I know this sounds vague, but like, like what people are doing now is like, there's stuff they care about in their system. This actually differs company across company. There's a set of endpoints. They sort of eyeball them week over week and see like, is anything wrong? And then if something's wrong in your system, you want to look at, a bunch of other graphs to see what might be causing things to go wrong. And so I would say what we're doing, we don't call it alerting or monitoring because we're like, our top our top value is not providing the alerts themselves, but it's really allowing people to see what's going on with their system. And so in DevOps, observability serves this function. A lot of people associate observability with very specific functions like, traces, logs, traces, and metrics. What we're doing is spiritually observability because we're giving people this understanding, but it's at the API level, which is why we call it API observability.
Okay. And then in terms of like how it works, is this, similar to like how a lot of modern logging systems where is agent model essentially sitting on these production systems that's pulling in, monitoring what's happening at the API level?
Yeah, exactly. So we modeled our agent insertion very similarly to Datadog. The big difference between us and some other systems is our agent requires no code annotations. That was really important to us because in order to get into a legacy subsystem or code that someone doesn't necessarily have a lot of ability or bandwidth to change, we want to be able to drop in. So we are based on something called BPF, Berkeley Packet Filter. We do passive traffic sniffing, essentially. And we're not the only company that uses BPF or eBPF, but we're the only company I know of that's put in a lot of work to make this data accessible. So there are a lot of companies out there So there are a lot of companies out there with an agent. Many of those will require some amount of code changes from the developer. Then of those companies that don't, like us, that are using something like traffic sniffing, most of every other company out there, they're really focused on, okay, this is some really high tech, really high cardinality, detailed data. What do you, the expert programmer, want to do about it? And we flipped that notion on its head and we said, look, this is an awesome technology, being able to watch systems without knowing anything about them. The challenge we set out for ourselves was, can we actually tell people stuff about their systems that are interesting that they didn't know without them giving us any information about their system besides installing?
So how do you actually go from essentially packet to reconstructing what's happening in the API layer?
So we use Go Packet. It's pretty standard packet reconstruction there. I would say the more interesting piece of that is how do we go from the reconstructed packets to actual API endpoints. And there we have heuristic algorithms that we worked on for years that look at individual API calls and consolidate into all the ones that are like users /user0/user1. That's like actually like the user path. And so instead of saying, hey, you have 3 million different endpoints that are like, user one / item 2 / thing 4, it's like, all right, it's like the user variable and then the item variable and then the thing variable, like that sounds like, to people who aren't using APIs a lot, like that sounds very boring and low level. But actually being able to collapse, 3 million calls into here are your 10,000 endpoints or 1,000 endpoints, that actually turned out to be the biggest win of what we were working on. Because we built that in order to do actually a bunch of other things. We thought, type inference or, what we're really doing this for is inferring properties and patterns that we see about APIs. And we've essentially stopped at just inferring the endpoints alone, tells people something they don't know about their system, like 90% of the time, which is, hey, did you know you have this endpoint in your system and you weren't thinking about it? And doing it with some level of fidelity has turned out to actually be super hard. It's still a work in progress for us to get the long tail of that. And even maybe the middle tail of that.
So it's essentially you're reconstructing the endpoints, you're being able to collapse them based on these patterns. So you're not reconstructing the body of the payload, just essentially the URL structure.
Yeah, just the endpoint. So our agent also pulls some information out of the body. We have a type inferencer. I will say that I feel like people are always saying, "Oh, that's really cool, that's really cute," but I don't know that anyone looks at the types. The structure of the endpoint seems to be the most useful, and then response code, and the basic request response metadata has turned out to be way more useful than I expected starting out.
And then all of this, presumably, is surfaced in like a dashboard where I can analyze it and see the breakdown of, potentially errors by endpoint and so forth.
Yeah. So in our Postman alpha, we're looking at which dashboards do our Postman users want to see now. With Akita, what we had was your errors over time, your performance over time, and the ability to slice and dice your endpoints by slowest, fastest, most used, least used, that kind of thing. And so we're looking at what dashboards do our alpha users in our Postman Live Insights product want to see now.
What were some of your observed some of the big aha moments for some of the customers that you worked with that were adopting the software? Were there things that they immediately recognized that they had no idea was a problem?
Yeah, so I had always operated under the mantra, show users something they don't know and show it to them as quickly as they could. And I had thought this would be something very fancy. Like, did you know you had this pattern about your systems? And I feel like the one lesson I keep learning is that the simplest thing is often the most useful thing. And so simply showing users their endpoints. Often, what they say is, oh, I knew about these 5. Wait, what's this endpoint doing here? Or once we started adding error and latency information, oh, I knew that these 5 were slow, but what's the 6th one doing being so slow? And so that was one big aha moment. And then another lesson I kept learning was users know best about their own systems. So I think initially we were all about like, we're going to automate all of path parameter inference, or we're going to automatically show people like, here are the top 5 things you care about. And what we realized was for different users, like our users are not dumb and they're very practical. And so sometimes they care about slowest, sometimes they care about this, sometimes they care about that. If you give them the right tools to search for the right parts of the information that you have, that's much more useful than trying to do everything for them. And so that lesson I learned in many forms over over the years.
And then, last year, in the last 6 months or so, you were acquired by Postman. So why sell to Postman?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say I am maybe a unusual entrepreneur in that, again, first, I got into the whole situation not to like have my own company forever, but because I felt like this problem needed to be solved, this product needed to exist. What this product looks like obviously evolved over time. Side note, we actually started out as an API security company to, show APIs for security vulnerabilities, and it evolved into a dev tool. But to me, I was always open to the idea that we could be better off as part of a bigger company, if simply for the reason that most dev tools live within bigger companies. Like, it is really hard to be a dev tool as a startup. And I'm not saying dev tool startups don't exist. Shout out to all the dev tool startups out there. I have a lot of respect for all of you guys. I think it's great that you're all fighting the good fight. But I think that having a bigger, being part of a bigger platform gives you a lot of ability to do things if you're a dev tool. And so I was always open to that possibility. I think that if you had asked me, maybe 5 years ago, which platform I would predict that we were part of, I would probably thought like Microsoft, because I think Microsoft is one of the best dev tools companies in the world, and the biggest platform, just like, I don't know, Microsoft absorbs all dev tools at some point. Um, but as of last year, I felt like we'd made really great independent progress in terms of building out the tech, defining the initial user base, really building something that seemed to be resonating with our early users. What we were missing was sort of what happens after the initial experience. So we built something, you could drop it in within 15 minutes, we show you some stuff. And then there was the question, and then what? And so, our early users were like, cool, we're using this in weekly ops review, but do you integrate, what happens when we mature a little bit? Can you build us this? Can you build us that? Do you integrate with Datadog next? And for us as a small company, if we just integrated with Datadog, we're kind of better off just maybe being part of them, And so at that point, we were also fundraising at the time. And so I felt it was prudent to think about, should we be part of a bigger platform, and what kind of bigger platform should we be a part of? And so Postman had approached us previously, Datadog, the usual suspects had all talked to us before. And what became really clear was we had a point of view on monitoring and observability that was actually much more compatible with an API company than with a monitoring and observability company, if that makes sense. Because every other monitoring and observability company, they had bet their everything on we're going to do alerts this way, or we're going to do tracing this way, or, they had their point of view. We actually have a pretty bold stake in the ground when it comes to API all day, API all the way. And so Postman was great. What we can offer you is we have this platform of people who use APIs all day. They want to know everything about their APIs. And there seemed to be just a lot of places we could collaborate there. And so it made a lot of sense. And I think that, to me, what was also compelling is Postman is a high growth startup. So it wasn't like going to a company where the pace of development or the pace of release slows to a grind. We're still releasing on about a weekly cadence. We have the freedom to be in alpha. We don't have super onerous security reviews at this point in our alpha. Postman has really, gone above and beyond to make sure we can preserve a lot of the velocity and innovation that, we had as an independent startup. And that was what was promised to us. And it's been delivering so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it feels like there's a natural alignment with the focus on APIs to a company like Postman. And I don't know, I have no data to back this up, so I'd be wildly wrong, but I feel like there's a lot of history and examples of startups that get acquired by really big entities where those companies kind of just die on the vine to some degree because they aren't given the resources or the time of day to actually continue the work. So it looks great as an entrepreneur, but might not necessarily be overall a great outcome for the product versus being acquired maybe by a fast growing startup where they're not going to waste time sort of just, buying something for the sake of of hiding it or not doing anything with it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I feel like Postman is in a situation where the leadership was way too focused on actually growing to acquire a company because they for vanity reasons or just in case to quiet a competitor or anything like that. I think it was very much the CEO said, look, if you join, this is our bet in API observability, and here's how we could work together. And that was very compelling to me because like I said, the mission and vision to me are more important than remaining solo or, making certain amounts of money or even, any other reason.
So now that you had this experience of being an entrepreneur under your belt and actually, even having a successful exit, think you'd ever do it again?
I think it really depends. I realized from this whole experience that I'm really a dev tools person. There's very little else in the world I want to do. So I'm friends with some other exited founders and I'll catch up with them and they're like, I'm really into this space now. And I'm just like, nope, I'm still into dev tools, gonna still be into dev tools. So I think I learned a few things about dev tools. I think once you do it once, you either decide, oh, it's not that hard, or you decide, oh, this is actually pretty hard. And I think my conclusion is it's actually really hard to start a like sustaining long-term dev tools company. But I thought this from the beginning. I think that if there is an existing company that allows you to do the dev tools thing you want to do, you save yourself a lot of time in some ways because you can directly work on it. Because I feel like in terms of like setting up the company, like, getting like the right stuff built to like start doing like the cool dev stuff, it takes a while. I also think that, even though dev tools is having something of a moment in terms of, until the recent investment turn of the tide, but dev tools was having a good moment in terms of getting investment, in terms of there are like way more dev tools companies than before. I think it definitely is possible to start a long-lasting freestanding dev tools company. HashiCorp is a company I super look up to. Docker had its ups and downs, but I'm a big fan of what they're doing these days. But I think it's really hard. I think if you're a database company, people pay for databases. I think like people's relationship with money and dev tools is a little more fraught. So I think I would have to have a pretty good idea of like, okay, this is why this is an independent company and not just part of another company to do it. I don't think I have the gene of like, well, I just really want to run my own company. So I think to me that's the big requirement. Like I feel like you have so many productive working years of your life. You kind of have to think about, how many years do I want to spend like setting something up versus like executing on something. And I think it would really depend on if I found the right thing to start again.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that if your goal is to work on dev tools and you can find a place where you can work on dev tools and kind of have, some level of, creative license to do that, then you don't have to do all the other things that come with entrepreneurship, fundraising and go to market and other parts that you have to think through and own that take away from the time that you might be focusing on actually building the product that you care about building.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a very compelling part of joining Postman. I feel like if there had been more dev tools companies at this stage when I was thinking about starting Akita, it would have been very compelling to think about joining them at the time. I feel like you start something if there's nothing out there that does the thing you want. And, you're, also, I think there's multiple reasons because if there's something out there that could do the thing you want, you don't want to start a company anyway. You're going to get crushed. But I think you have to believe there's significant advantage in starting something to do it.
I guess you could start something that exists, provided you have kind of a unique take on it, or there's existing pain with that thing that people are using.
Yeah. Or, I guess you feel like you're uniquely positioned to do something because I think that also once you start thinking through, like, this is what my company should do, you think through, like, if Datadog could spin up a team to do this, or, if so-and-so could spin up a team to do it, it's kind of a not the best use of your time either. And so, I think I like the reasons to start a company that for me are like, very, very not different from the reasons someone should start a company in general. But I think that when I first started Akita, I was more optimistic about what can't be done at a different company. And once I started really thinking through strategy and things like that, I sort of realized like, hey, actually, you have to be interested in like a pretty narrow set of things for this to work.
So as we start to wrap up, I want to go quick fire here. So I'm going to ask you some questions. This is something new we're trying. So don't think too hard. Just give me the first answer that comes into your mind. So first off, if you could master one skill you don't have right now, what would it be?
Being a better sleeper. I feel like sleep is the foundation of all the rest of life. I'm a terrible sleeper. I have to work so hard at it. If I could sleep better, more easily, go to sleep faster, stay asleep, like my life would be so much easier.
If you could invest in one company that's not the company you work for, who would it be?
I think Common Room. I feel like I still believe dev tools are having a moment. I think dev communities are really interesting, and tracking not in an enterprise way, but tracking individual developer adopters of dev tools is very powerful. And I am optimistic about the future of dev tools, startups in general. So yeah, Common Room.
What tool or technology could you not live without?
I like to think that I can live without anything, but I can't live without most things. I would say it's probably my super high resolution monitor. So I think that I am 5 times more productive with my monitor. Whenever I work without it, I get eye strain, I get less done. It's very great. Yeah.
Which person influenced you the most in your career?
I would say probably my undergrad mentor, a person named Margot Seltzer. She, well, she taught me what imposter syndrome was. She taught me not to make a big deal out of making mistakes, and she taught me to keep going about stuff. And it was Margot and another undergrad professor I had, Radhika Nagpal, who told me to start finishing things because she noticed that I sort of assumed that I wasn't smart enough to finish some of the big projects I took on. And she observed that no, you're just actually not finishing them. Like being smart has nothing to do with it. You're just not doing them. Um, I think the combination of those two things, because I think for somehow I had this notion that, I'm not a genius. So like I work on something for a day and if it doesn't work, I should just give up. And I would say like, oh, like I'm not smart enough. If I ask a question and it was the wrong question, I should just stop asking questions. And they both took me aside and they were like, who do you think you are? Like you need to actually put work in. You need to be wrong sometimes. You need to, do stuff that takes longer than a day. And I think teaching me to actually put the work in. I think sometimes lack of confidence is an excuse just to do nothing, which I was clearly doing sometimes. Um, and I think they taught me not to do that / called me out.
What's the probability that AI equals doom for the human race?
The people who worry that AI can take everything over, that's so much hubris. That's saying that like humans can create something so much bigger than ourselves that kills us. And here's what I'm seeing. So I have this blog post I wrote a few years ago about what I call the spam filter apocalypse. So we have this friend who didn't come to this event we organized because we got spam filtered in her email. And then I talked to some other people. I realized like, hey, spam filters are actually really bad. I talked to some people, they were starting a startup. They actually like almost died because no one was receiving their emails because they were getting spam filtered. And I was like, oh my God, spam filters are so powerful. Not because they're smart, like they're Bayesian filters. It's like one of like the dumbest AIs you could have out there. They're powerful because we allow them to be a layer between us and our email. And so I think, well, it's one of those things. Yeah, like I feel like in life, there people say you can only feel bad. People can only make you feel bad if you make yourself feel bad. I feel like AI can only take stuff over if we let them take over, because people are like, oh my God, these machines, they're going to attack. Like you can turn off your computer. Like the only reason your computer is not turning off is because you are letting it not turn off. You know what I mean? And so this relates to my point generally that software is the biggest social problem we're not talking about. Like we're letting software have all this power that it doesn't need to have. We're not talking about the power it's having. And maybe this is what people mean, but I don't think so. I feel like people are actually imagining like the AI like jumps out of the monitor or something like that. Like I'm like 0% afraid of that, but I read a really good book a few years ago called The Fires by this guy named Joe Flood, very ironically. And it was about how a very progressive government in New York City, because of algorithms by the Rand Corporation, actually ended up allowing the destruction by fire of a bunch of Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York. And the danger there was, they trusted an algorithm. The algorithm told them to underallocate firefighting resources and maintenance of infrastructure in those neighborhoods, and it led to outcomes that were against what they stood for as a progressive government. And so I feel like those are very powerful cases, but that's not AI, man. That's like algorithms from the 70s. And sure, like you could argue that's AI, and like spam filters are also AI. But I think it's very different than how people are thinking about the doom today.
Awesome. Anything else you'd like to share, and how can people reach out to you?
So I'm on X a lot. I'm Jean Kassor on X. And that's pretty much the only way. I mean, email kind of works, but I get a lot of spam, maybe due to not trusting spam filters.
Well, Deep, thanks so much for coming on Software Huddle. I think we covered the gambit of topics today. I think we'd love to have you back down the road. I'm sure there's a ton of other things we could get into.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. This was super fun.
Thank you. Cheers.